Thank you so much. Thanks for the organizers for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. And thank you all for coming. So what I'm going to present today is rooted in a couple of projects which were started by a grant from the Mind and Life organization. And it involved people mostly in the humanities and social sciences thinking about the scientific study of meditation. And so this resulted in one edited volume with a lot of different, some philosophers, anthropologists, religious study scholars, called Meditation, Buddhism, and Science, and a more recent publication that I published expanding on some of these themes called Rethinking Meditation. And part of this, what I'm going to present today is just a little slice of the latter book. And it started out with my coming across a podcast that I found kind of funny and interesting and maybe a little disturbing. And it was an interview with a neuroscientist that these podcasters were doing. And they were envisioning the possibility of what they called an enlightenment machine, a kind of brain scanning machine that could, in their words, assess where you are on the neural map of meditative cartographies, and thereby possibly accelerating the process towards advanced meditative states and even towards enlightenment itself. They said it could provide empirical data and objective assessment of your practice, adjudicate claims by teachers to some sort of enlightenment or advanced spiritual status, and maybe even send data back to a central database to be used for others to help them chart their neural course through these different stages of enlightenment. And they were being a little bit playful. I think nobody really thought this was going to happen next year or anything, but I think the underlying ideas were there and, interestingly, are shared by more mainstream scientists studying meditation. And in fact, there are a few less ambitious meditation and enlightenment machines out there. And if you look at some of the marketing language for some of these, they're basically kind of EEG machines that you can put on your head. They promise that you can experience the benefits of meditation without the uncertainty. They confer objective information about states of mind. They measure your brain activity and give real-time feedback to help guide your meditative practice. So all of these, again, sort of have a certain underlying implicit ideas, and that's what I'm interested in here, and I'm interested in sort of moving towards maybe some alternative ideas. So the underlying ideas, I think, first of all, is that meditation is in part about gaining an objective view on the model of science of subjective contents of experience, and that's mainly what it's about, or getting the brain into a specific state that is repeatable, testable, and observable through various neuroimaging machines. And to expand on the second point, it implies the self as brain. Personhood is essentially identical with the brain and its functions. Some scholars have called this the neurochemical self or the cerebral subject. And there's also a kind of faith in brain scanning machinery that it captures a kind of visual proof of brain activity. And there's a huge amount of debate about that. Just what is it that you can discern through, say, an fMRI scan? What does it mean? How do we interpret it? Some people have called it blobology because you see all these blobs and you're sort of interpreting it like a Rorschach test. And so those are sort of the two underlying ideas. And the implications and assumptions for the study of contemplative practices is that, again, meditation, spiritual practice, enlightenment itself is a matter of getting the brain into a certain state. that mental states have certain neural signatures, and since all brains are essentially the same, this must be the same for everybody everywhere, and that it's impossible, at least in theory, to track these objectively through various brain scanning devices. Now, what I want to suggest is missing from all this, and I'm not against this kind of study. I'm actually very interested in the, people putting meditators into MRI machines and seeing where the blood is going in their brain and so on, and trying to figure out objective data for that. But what makes me uncomfortable as a historian of religion is what this leaves out. And I think what it leaves out is context. It also implies a kind of theater of the mind model, which, as we've just heard, sort of is a Western model coming from Descartes, a picture of the mind as a container of thoughts that can be observed through introspection, and that accurate access to things is basically through a kind of disengaged observation that presumes a kind of neutrality, and that meditation is defined is a kind of refined method of observing interior states, the stream of consciousness, or laws of nature operating within the mind and ascertaining them with a kind of idealized objective clarity like scientific investigation. So for a possible move away from that model, I want to start with an observation of the philosopher Evan Thompson, who has written a lot on Buddhism. And he was the co-author, you may know, with Francisco Varela of a very seminal book in cognitive sciences called The Embodied Mind. And he says in a recent article, actually in one of the pieces in my volume, that he used to see mindfulness as a special kind of inner observation of a mental stream whose phenomenal character is independent of such observation. In other words, sort of like a super telescope that just sort of allows you to zero in on parts of your mind, and that those parts are sort of there no matter what is going on. And now he's sort of changed his understanding of mindfulness to suggest that mindfulness is rather an integrated exercise of a host of cognitive, affective, and bodily skills in situated action. It's a species of embodied and active social and cultural activity. And he suggests on the basis of that the inadequacy of a purely neurological account of mindfulness. It's as if one were to try to find a kind of neurological account of good parenting. It's something that doesn't just happen in the lab, it's something that pervades your whole life, it's a whole way of being. So it's that I think the sciences and the scientific study of meditation need to start taking more account of. That is, the idea of the broader context of human life that's happening outside the laboratory. One way to think of this broader context was suggested by the philosopher Charles Taylor. It's a term called the social imaginary. And this is a kind of intersubjectively shared life world along the lines of Husserl. I'm glad you set this up nicely. And we could see this in the context of meditation as a sort of nested set of concerns. So for any meditator, there are going to be some very central beliefs, ethical orientation, goals, concepts, values that are implicit or explicit within the meditative practice. And so there's a certain philosophy of meditation, there's a certain philosophy of what you're supposed to be doing, there's an ethical dimension to it. And then that is all nestled in a larger social cultural context, which has social forms, cultural habits and norms, implicit understandings, default intuitions, and then large-scale social political structures, institutions, physical conditions, and even how one envisions the cosmos, I think, can make a real difference. Do we live in a kind of empty, cold, vast universe, maybe sort of accidental specks of life merging here and there? Or do we live in a cycle of rebirth? There are many possible ways of envisioning the cosmos and envisioning what you're doing in it. So, this suggests, if we want to reconceive of meditation, that a kind of study of meditation that takes into account all these things, it would suggest that meditative practices are ways of cultivating particular sensibilities, dispositions, aspirations, moral intuitions, and elevated states within specific taxonomies in a tradition, which in turn are interwoven into a social imaginary. And such practices do particular kinds of work that can only make sense in terms of that complex network of contextual factors. Again, doctrinal, ethical, social, cultural, natural, national, and cosmic. This is why I'm sort of trying to shift from just the question, how do meditative practices work, which implies that they are kind of going to work exactly the same way for everybody in any cultural situation, to what work do these practices do in a particular situation. This involves reconditioning as well as deconditioning. It involves a certain kind of experience negotiation. In other words, in the West, we tend to take independent interior experience as ultimately authoritative. But if you study meditation with a teacher, many of you I'm sure know, and your experience, your interpretation of your experience is really a kind of negotiation, you know. You go to your meditation teacher and say, hey, guess what? I've just achieved enlightenment. And he's going to say, yeah, let's talk about it. Let's negotiate that. That's right. So, and of course, the Zen tradition is very notable for that sort of tussling. Meditative experience, in this sense, then, is not just the private empirical observation of mental contents, but is a kind of dialogical process in systemic relation to, say, one's teacher, to the tradition, to the broader culture and its categories and ideals, not just private mental states or neural states. So, one way to start thinking about consciousness, not just contained in the head, is there are a number of models for this, but one emerging out of the phenomenological tradition and is a kind of embodied cognition model. And illustrating that, Alva Noe says, to understand consciousness, the fact that we think and feel and that the world shows up for us, we need to look at a larger system of which the brain is only one element. Consciousness is not something the brain achieves on its own. Consciousness requires the joint operation of brain, body, and world. Indeed, consciousness is an achievement of the whole animal in its environmental context. To have a mind requires more than a brain. So, I think if we imagine then the different possibilities for how people might do even a very simple practice like breath awareness, and you imagine somebody doing that in a corporate mindfulness class in which a lot of the underlying motivation is to make workers more efficient, versus doing that same practice in a very traditional Buddhist framework where you're thinking of a cycle of rebirth and karma and the possibility of attaining enlightenment. Or if you're thinking of it, if you're doing the practice within a kind of psychological model or a Western philosophical model. These all have real differences. And these, I think, in the study of meditation need to be taken account of. So in that sense, again, if we're going to rethink contemplative science, meditative practice is not simply a matter of getting the brain into a certain state, but rather is a practice systemically intertwined with the practitioner's social, cultural, and cosmic world. And context is not just kind of an extra layer on top of the practice, but is essential to these practices and partially constitutive of contemplative experiences. One problem for the scientific study of meditation, too, is if we're to take this idea seriously, it means that the isolation of meditation from the rest of life for the sake of scientific study may inevitably distort how it works in people's lives. And also I want to emphasize that this cultural account of meditation doesn't mean that we're trapped in our social imaginaries and that meditation merely produces experiences that are prefigured by them. In fact, I argue in the book that meditation does in fact disrupt many dominant assumptions, helps create new ideas, and reconfigure the social imaginary, producing novel experiences. So, the reason then that I think I'm skeptical of the Enlightenment machine is that it basically, rather than giving us simply objective facts about the brain, it is necessarily programmed with the programmer's particular religious, philosophical ideas, taxonomies, and these would be encoded in the machine as measures of spiritual progress. So what is enlightenment? What is the version of enlightenment that's going to be programmed into the machine? Is it transcendence of the cycle of karma and rebirth? Is it union with Brahman or Yahweh? Is it a Maslowian peak experience? So, to conclude, the general suggestions would be to recontextualize contemplative practices, to integrate scientific evidence with literature with evidence from literature, sociology, anthropology, religious studies, philosophy, and history. Measure what is measurable, certainly, but not make the mistake of thinking that these scientific measurements get down to the real facts about meditation, to which other data are extraneous. Again, these social factors, and an attempt to bring all these together systemically. Thank you very much.